My wife toasted her affair at my table. My daughter smiled and backed her up. I said nothing. Walked out. 3 weeks later, her elite attorney hit a wall he never saw coming, because the man they both underestimated had been building it for years. My name is Philip Stanton. I'm 54 years old. I spent 26 years as a public servant, working my way from a junior project coordinator to director of the Millbrook Municipal Development Agency, the office responsible for every major infrastructure contract in our county: roads, water systems, affordable housing grants. I was the man who made things happen, quietly, without press conferences or ribbon-cutting photo ops. That was fine by me. I never needed applause. What I thought I had was a wife who understood that kind of man. Her name was Linda. We met when I was 27, married at 29. She was sharp, funny, the kind of woman who could walk into any room and own it inside of 5 minutes. I admired that about her. I still do, in the detached way you admire a storm you survived. We had one daughter, Kayla, 22 years old and just starting to find her footing in the world, or so I thought. And then there was Barry Holt. Barry had been my friend since our early 30s. We met at a city planning conference, bonded over bad hotel coffee and worse keynote speakers. Over the years, he became a fixture in our lives: cookouts, holidays, my daughter's graduation party. He was the man I called when my father died and I didn't know how to say it out loud. He was also, as it turned out, the man my wife had been sleeping with for at least 14 months. I didn't confront anyone the night I found out. I'm not built that way. The evening I want to tell you about was a Saturday dinner in late October. One of those slow-burn autumn nights where the air smells like wood smoke and everything feels like it should be fine. Linda had arranged it herself. Candles on the table, her good dishes out, a bottle of Cabernet already open. Barry was there. Kayla was there. Two of Linda's friends whose names I won't bother to include because they don't matter. I sat at the head of my own table and watched the evening unfold like a play I hadn't been given the script for. The conversation was easy. Too easy. Barry was relaxed in a way that set something off in the back of my mind. That particular looseness a man gets when he's stopped being afraid of something. He poured Linda's wine before she asked. She let him. Neither of them noticed me noticing. Then Linda raised her glass. To being honest with ourselves, she said, her eyes moving around the table with that stage-managed warmth she used when she wanted people to feel included in something. And to the people who make that possible. Barry touched his glass to hers first, a half-second before anyone else. My daughter smiled and lifted hers, nodding like she'd just witnessed something brave. That was the moment. Not a confession, not a scene, just a toast that meant something I wasn't supposed to understand. I understood it completely. I set my glass down without drinking. Nobody noticed that, either. Kayla leaned forward and said, brightly like she was delivering good news, "Mom's been really happy lately, Dad. I think that's worth celebrating." I looked at my daughter across the table, the girl I taught to ride a bike on the driveway of our first house, who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from her soccer games, and I saw something in her face that I hadn't expected. Not guilt, not discomfort, satisfaction. She knew. She had known, and she had decided which side of the table she was sitting on. I reached for my water glass, took a slow sip, and said, quietly and without any particular heat, "Happiness is good, as long as it's built on something that holds." Linda's smile didn't falter. Barry's did, just slightly, just for a moment. I excused myself after the main course. Said I had an early call with the county assessor's office. Shook Barry's hand, firm, unhurried, the way you shake the hand of a man you've already decided how to deal with. He met my eyes for exactly 1 second before looking away. I drove to the storage unit I kept off Route 9, the one Linda thought held old furniture and equipment from my father's estate. I sat in the car for a while with the engine off. Then I opened the metal door, pulled the chain on the overhead light, and looked at the filing cabinet in the corner. 22 months of documentation, organized by date, cross-referenced by account. Howard Bellick had helped me structure it. He'd been my attorney for 19 years, the executor of my grandfather's trust, and the quietest weapon I owned. I called him the next morning at 7:45. "It's time," I said. "I'll have the papers ready by noon," he replied. No questions, no drama, just two men who had planned for exactly this. I filed for divorce at 8:06 the following Tuesday. Linda didn't notice I was gone until after lunch. I've been asked before what it feels like to walk away from a marriage you spent 25 years building. People expect something dramatic. Tears, shaking hands, a moment where the weight of it all lands on your chest like a stone. But the morning I filed for divorce, I felt something closer to clarity. The kind of stillness that comes after a long decision finally made. Not peace exactly, just the absence of pretending. I was out of the house before 6. The guest suite at my colleague Dennis Farrow's place had been waiting for 2 weeks. I'd arranged it quietly, the way I arranged most things. One bag, my laptop, the folder of documents I've been building since February. Linda was still asleep when I pulled out of the driveway. I didn't look back. Howard Bellick's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that smelled like old carpet and serious money. Howard himself looked the same as he had for the 19 years I'd known him. Compact, unhurried, with the kind of face that gave nothing away. He had the divorce petition and supporting filings laid out on his desk in 2 neat stacks before I even sat down. "Everything's in order," he said, sliding the first stack toward me. "The petition references standard grounds. The asset documentation is separate and sealed until we need it." I signed where he indicated, slowly and deliberately. 7 signatures in total. Each one felt like closing a door I'd been standing in front of for a long time. "She'll have a lawyer contact you within the week," Howard added, capping his pen. "When they do, say nothing. Send them to me." "That's the plan," I replied. I was back in my car by 8:15. The filing timestamp read 8:06 a.m. Linda's first text came at 2:47 in the afternoon. "Where are you? Did you go somewhere without telling me again?" No greeting. No concern. Just the default irritation of a woman who expected me to be available and wasn't used to the alternative. I read it, set the phone face down on the seat, and kept driving. Her second text, 20 minutes later. "Philip, I'm serious. Call me." My response was the tracking number for the envelope Howard's courier had already delivered to her attorney of record, a man named Keswick whose firm advertised heavily on local radio. Linda would have chosen him the way she chose most things, by whoever sounded most confident. She called 4 times between 3 and 4 o'clock. I watched each call come and go. The 5th time, she left a voicemail. I listened to it once. Her voice was controlled, but the edges were starting to show. Not grief, not shock, just the particular frustration of someone who'd expected to be the one driving. "Philip, this is ridiculous. Whatever you think you know, we should talk before you do something you can't undo. Call me back." I didn't. What she didn't know, what she'd never bother to find out, was that the doing had already been done. Had been done, in fact, for most of the past year. The storage unit off Route 9 held more than documents. It held the paper trail of every asset I'd quietly moved, restructured, and placed under Howard's executive oversight before Linda had ever started spending her Tuesday evenings with Barry Holt. The Stanton Family Trust had been established 11 years earlier, just after my grandfather passed, and left me his share of a property development partnership in 3 counties. Linda had been present at exactly 1 meeting about it. She'd lasted 40 minutes before checking her phone and asking when we'd be done. I'd thanked her for coming and never invited her back. She seemed relieved. Over the years, that trust had grown in ways she never asked about. I'd mention it occasionally, at dinner, in passing, and she'd wave a hand and say something like, "You and your paperwork, Philip. I trust you," which was a particular kind of irony, given what I was uncovering about her. Barry Holt, as it turned out, was not a man of means. Howard's financial investigator had spent 6 weeks pulling the threads. Barry's dealership had a line of credit he was perpetually behind on. His personal accounts showed regular deposits that didn't match his business income, deposits that matched, almost to the dollar, a series of transfers Linda had been making from our joint checking account over a period of 14 months. $62,000 in total, categorized in her records as household expenses and charitable giving. I'd saved that spreadsheet in 3 separate places. That evening, I sat at the small desk in Dennis's guest room and opened the folder one more time. Not because I needed to review it, just because there's something grounding about looking at the truth written down in clean columns. Numbers don't perform. They don't smile at dinner tables or raise glasses to their own betrayal. I thought about Kayla, about the look on her face when she'd said her mother deserved to be happy. There was a time that sentence from my daughter would have meant something warm. Now it landed differently. Not because she was wrong about happiness, but because of everything that Look told me, she already knew and had chosen to keep from me. I closed the folder and called Howard one more time. "One more thing," I said. "The will. Let's talk about the revision." A brief pause. Then, "I was wondering when you'd bring that up." "I'm bringing it up now," I said. "Come in Thursday morning," Howard replied. "I'll have a draft ready." I said goodnight and turned off the light. Outside, the October wind was moving through the trees on Dennis's street. Somewhere across town, Linda was realizing that the man she'd counted on being predictable had been anything but. The letter from Linda's attorney arrived on a Wednesday. Not to me directly, to Howard's office, as I'd instructed. Howard called me at 10:15 that morning, his voice carrying that particular flatness he reserved for things he found professionally insulting. "They sent a demand letter," he said. "Keswick and Associates. Standard aggressive opener. Sole possession of the primary residence. Full spousal maintenance. Division of pension assets. And half the value of the Route 9 storage property." I was standing at the window of my borrowed office at Dennis's firm, watching a city maintenance crew repave the parking lot below. "The storage property," I repeated. "She apparently believes it contains furniture and equipment worth roughly $40,000. I said nothing for a moment. Outside, a worker in an orange vest guided a roller over fresh asphalt with slow, careful passes. "Howard," I finally said, "send him your response. The one-page version." "Already drafted," he replied. "I'll have it couriered this afternoon." What Keswick's office received 4 hours later was a single sheet of heavy cream paper. No firm letterhead, just Howard's name, his bar number, and a watermark seal at the bottom. It stated, in precise and unhurried language, that all assets of significance were held under the Stanton Family Trust, established prior to the marriage, governed by irrevocable executive clause, and not subject to community property division under the applicable statutes. It invited them to request the supporting documentation at their convenience. They requested it the next morning. Howard sent them 61 pages. I know because he forwarded me the transmission confirmation with a note that said simply, "They'll need a few days." What those pages contained was the complete paper architecture of everything I'd built over 11 years. Property titles, LLC registrations, trust amendments, notarized transfer records, tax filings going back to the year the trust was established. Every number clean, every date verifiable, every signature witnessed and recorded. And buried on page 44, the item I most wanted Keswick to find, a financial forensic summary prepared by a licensed investigator, documenting $62,000 in transfers from our joint checking account to a private account registered to one Barry Holt, classified in Linda's personal records as household expenses and charitable contributions. I wasn't filing criminal charges. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to make sure Keswick understood, clearly and early, exactly what kind of terrain he was walking into. He called Howard that Friday afternoon. I was told the conversation lasted 9 minutes. Howard summarized it in one sentence. "He's no longer optimistic." Good, I thought. He shouldn't be. She showed up at Dennis's house on a Thursday evening without calling ahead. I saw her car pull into the driveway from the upstairs window. That little silver sedan I'd helped her pick out 2 years ago, the one she'd hugged me for in the dealership parking lot. I stood at the window for a moment before going downstairs. She was on the front step when I opened the door, arms crossed against the November chill, chin lifted in that particular way she had when she was preparing to say something she'd rehearsed. "Can we talk?" Kayla asked. I stepped aside and let her in. Didn't offer coffee. Didn't make small talk. I sat in the armchair by the window, and she took the couch, perching on the edge of it like she wasn't planning to stay long. "Dad," she began, "I think you're making this into something bigger than it needs to be. Tell me what you think it is," I said evenly. She exhaled. "Mom made a mistake. People make mistakes. You've been together for 25 years, and you're just going to throw that away." I watched her for a moment. "Kayla, how long did you know?" The question landed. Her jaw tightened just slightly, and she looked at the floor for half a second before pulling her eyes back up. "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point," I replied. "I'm not asking to make you feel bad. I'm asking because the answer matters." She pressed her lips together. "Mom needed someone to talk to, and you decided that meant keeping it from me. I didn't want to be in the middle of it." I leaned forward and folded my hands. "You were already in the middle of it the moment you knew and said nothing. That was your choice. I respect that you made it. But here's what I need you to understand. Choices have weight. They land somewhere. Kayla's expression shifted then, moving from prepared to uneasy. What does that mean? It means I revised my last week, I said. Calm. Direct. The same tone I used in agency meetings when I was delivering a decision that wasn't up for debate. She stared at me. You're joking. I'm not. Because of this. Because of one conversation at dinner. Because of 14 months of silence. I answered. And because of the way you looked at your mother when she made that toast. You weren't surprised, Kayla. You were pleased. The color shifted in her face. She opened her mouth and closed it again. You were in the trust, I continued. You're not anymore. That's not a threat, and it's not a tantrum. It's a reflection of conduct. Howard filed the revision 4 days ago. It's clean, and it's done. She stood up, and for a moment I thought she might raise her voice. Instead, she said, quietly, and with a sharpness that reminded me of her mother at her worst, you can't punish me for loving her. I'm not punishing you for loving her, I replied, standing as well. I'm holding you accountable for choosing deception over honesty with a man who never once deceived you. There's a difference. Look it up. She left without another word. I heard her car back out of the driveway and disappear down the street. I sat back down and stayed there for a while in the quiet. Then I picked up my phone and sent Howard a message. Add the conduct clause language we discussed. Make it airtight. His reply came 3 minutes later. Already in the draft. See you Monday. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a legal process when the other side finally understands what they're up against. It doesn't happen loudly. There's no single moment you can point to. It comes gradually, in the shrinking confidence of their letters, in the longer gaps between responses, in the slow shift from demands to requests. I watched it happen over 3 weeks in November, and I won't pretend I didn't find a quiet satisfaction in it. Keswick's office filed their first asset freeze motion on a Monday morning. Howard called me before 9 with the news, and I could hear the faint amusement underneath his professional tone. They're targeting the Route 9 storage property and the 2 downtown commercial units, he said. Standard freeze request pending equitable division review. And I prompted, and both came back rejected by end of day. The storage property is titled under Stanton Holdings LLC, which is a subsidiary of the family trust. The commercial units are held under a separate instrument established in 2016. Neither qualifies as marital property under the governing statutes. He paused. The clerk stamped the rejection and read. I framed a copy for the office. I allowed myself a short laugh, the first genuine one in weeks. Keswick tried again 4 days later, this time targeting my pension portfolio and what he described as shared passive income streams. Howard's response was a single paragraph citing the Trust Governance Clause and 3 relevant case precedents. The freeze request was denied within 48 hours. On the 3rd attempt, they went after the lake property in Whitmore County, a 4-acre lot with a cabin that Linda had claimed as our family retreat in her supporting declaration. She'd hosted her book club there twice. She had photos of herself on the dock that she'd posted publicly. She'd apparently decided that visibility constituted ownership. The property deed said otherwise. Whitmore Lake Lot B, 12 had been transferred to the Stanton Family Trust 7 years earlier, during a routine restructuring Howard and I conducted after my uncle's estate was settled. It had never been marital property. It had never been anything other than what it was. When Keswick's paralegal called Howard's office to demand clarification, Howard read them the deed number, the transfer date, and the trust instrument reference. Then he said, politely and without any trace of condescension, your client is welcome to continue filing motions. We have responses prepared for each scenario. They didn't file again that week. What I did that Friday was drive out to the Whitmore property alone. I unlocked the cabin, walked through the 3 rooms, looked at the dock through the back window. Linda's book club had left a coffee mug in the cabinet. I set on the counter and left it there. Then I drove back to town and called Howard. The conduct clause in the will, I said. I want a secondary provision added. Anything tied to public statements that could damage the trust standing. Howard was quiet for a moment. You're thinking about what happens if she talks to the press. I'm thinking about what happens before she thinks to think about it. I replied. I'll have language drafted by Wednesday, he said. It'll be clean. I was counting on that. What I hadn't yet told Howard, because I was still assembling the full picture, was what Dennis had quietly discovered through a mutual contact in the city's business licensing office. Barry Holt's dealership had filed for a payment extension on its commercial lease 3 months running. His personal credit profile showed 2 accounts in collections and a vehicle loan 60 days past due. The man my wife had been financing with $62,000 of our joint money was himself drowning. She'd been propping up a man who was sinking, using resources that weren't hers to spend, while I kept the house paid, the accounts funded, and the future structured. The picture it made was not a flattering one for either of them. I added the credit report to the folder in the storage unit and drove home to Dennis's house, which I'd stopped thinking of as temporary and started thinking of as mine for now, which was fine. A man who knows what he owns doesn't need an address to feel settled. Kayla had been quiet for 10 days after our conversation at Dennis's house. No calls, no messages, one brief text that said only, "I hope you know what you're doing." I read it, noted the absence of a question mark, and moved on. Then she announced the wedding venue. She was engaged to a young man named Brett, a decent enough person from what I'd seen, though I'd only met him twice and neither occasion had left a strong impression. The engagement had been announced in September. I congratulated her by phone, sent a card, and said nothing about timing. It wasn't my business to manage her life, but the venue was my business. Because the venue she announced, in a group text to her mother and 3 friends that I was not included in, but Dennis's wife happened to see, was the Whitmore Lake property. "Can't wait to get married at the cabin," she wrote. "The dock is going to be perfect." She had never asked me. She had assumed, the way people assume things they believe are already theirs, that the property was available, accessible, and waiting for her plans. I said nothing when I found out. I made one call to Howard, one call to the property management company that handled the cabin's exterior maintenance, and sent one instruction: change the access codes, update the locks, and post the trust standard private property notice at the gate. It was done within 48 hours. Kayla and Brett drove out the following Saturday with champagne and what I was later told was a drone for aerial photos. They found the gate locked, the keypad unresponsive, and a laminated notice attached to the post that read, "Private property of Stanton Family Trust. Unauthorized access subject to civil action. Contact trust administrator for inquiries." She called me 5 times in 40 minutes. I watched each call arrive and pass. On the 6th attempt, she left a voicemail. Her voice was tight, working hard to sound controlled. "Dad, the code doesn't work, and there's a sign on the gate. Brett thinks it's a mistake. Call me back." Brett was wrong. It wasn't a mistake. I didn't call her back. Howard's office sent her a brief, formal email the following morning, referencing the trust property governance clause and noting that access to trust-held properties required written authorization from the executive, which was Howard himself, and could not be assumed by any family member whose standing with the trust was currently under conduct review. That last phrase, conduct review, was one Howard had suggested. I'd approved it immediately. It was accurate, precise, and it would make her think. People who've never had their conduct formally reviewed before tend to take notice when it's named out loud. She didn't call again after the email. What she did instead was show up at Dennis's house the following Tuesday evening, Brett waiting in the car in the driveway. She stood in the front room with her coat still on and her arms folded and said, without preamble, "This is because of the will, isn't it? You're punishing me. I'm applying trust governance." I answered, standing by the window. "The property isn't available to individuals whose conduct standing is under review. That applies regardless of family relationship. I'm your daughter." "You are," I agreed. "That's not in question." "Then why does it feel like you're cutting me out of my own family?" I looked at her steadily. "Because you cut yourself in with your mother when you decided her affair was worth protecting. That was your call to make. This is mine." Brett honked once from the driveway, lightly, uncertainly, the honk of a man who didn't know what was happening inside and wasn't sure he wanted to. Kayla glanced toward the window, then back at me. "What would it take?" she said, her voice quieter now, some of the rehearsed edge gone out of it. "For you to reconsider?" "Time," I answered. "And honesty. Not with me, with yourself." I moved toward the door and held it open. "Drive safe, Kayla." She walked out without another word. I watched the car back down the driveway and disappear around the corner. Then I sat down, opened my laptop, and drafted the language for an updated beneficiary review clause, one that tied reinstatement to a written acknowledgement of conduct reviewed annually by Howard. It took me 20 minutes. I sent it to Howard at 10:15 that night. He responded at 10:40. Elegant. I'll incorporate it by Thursday. Linda had a talent for optics. She understood, instinctively, how things looked from a distance, what registered as poised, what registered as wronged, what registered as worthy of sympathy. She'd used that talent on social committees, on neighborhood boards, at charity auctions where she stood at podiums in well-chosen dresses and made people feel like they were part of something. I had admired it once. Now I watched her apply it to her divorce strategy, and I recognized the playbook even if she didn't know I did. She found a new attorney in December. Not Keswick. Keswick had apparently told her, with professional delicacy, that the case had become structurally challenging. His replacement was a man named Galton, from a firm with a glass and steel office downtown that advertised itself as a leader in high-asset family litigation. He wore pocket squares and spoke in the measured cadence of someone who had won in courtrooms before and expected a win in this one. His first move was a motion to compel full asset disclosure, arguing that the documentation Howard had provided was insufficient and that additional hidden holdings might exist outside the trust structure. The motion used phrases like deliberate opacity and systematic concealment. It was well written. It was also wrong. Howard's response arrived at Galton's office on a Tuesday morning. A bound submission, 94 pages, that included every asset instrument, every LLC registration, every tax filing, every notarized transfer going back to the year the trust was established. It also included, as an appendix, a certified statement from an independent CPA affirming that no marital funds have been used to establish, maintain, or improve any trust-held asset during the marriage. Galton called Howard that afternoon. I was told he asked 3 questions, received 3 precise answers, and ended the call in under 6 minutes. But it was the following Thursday that things shifted in a way even Galton hadn't prepared for. His paralegal had been cross-referencing trust documents against public property records, looking for anything that might create an opening. She found a name she didn't recognize attached to several of the key instruments. Not a firm name, a personal name. Howard Bellick. She ran a search. No website. No social media presence. No LinkedIn profile. No firm directory listing. Just a bar number and a watermark seal that appeared on every document of consequence in the case. She brought it to Galton. He brought it to Linda. Who is Howard Bellick? Linda demanded in a meeting I was later given a full account of by Howard himself, who found the episode quietly entertaining. Galton had shrugged. He's your husband's attorney. Apparently has been for nearly 2 decades. I've never heard that name in my life. That, Galton replied, appears to be precisely the point. What Linda did not know, had never asked about, had never cared to know, was that Howard had been the executive of the Stanton Family Trust since its founding, the silent architect of every financial structure I'd built over 11 years, and a man who had drafted the conduct clause in my revised will 3 weeks before she received the divorce filing. Howard didn't advertise. He didn't network at Gallus. He didn't need to. His clients found him through quiet referrals and kept him through results. I had inherited him, in a sense, from my grandfather's estate attorney, and keeping him had been one of the most consistently correct decisions of my adult life. The moment Linda understood that every document of consequence in her divorce case bore the signature of a man she'd never heard of, a man who had been managing my affairs, quietly and completely, for 19 years while she ate my food and spent my money and told her friends I was boring, I'm told her face did something specific. Not anger, not grief, just a long, suspended moment of comprehension arriving about 2 decades late. Galton told her, carefully, that the trust structure was among the most comprehensively documented he had encountered. He recommended a settlement discussion. Linda said she wanted to fight it. Galton said she could, but that she should understand what she was fighting. That same afternoon, Linda had called Kayla and asked her to be present at the office for moral support during what she described as a strategy session. Kayla arrived at 4 o'clock in a coat she hadn't fully unbuttoned, the way people dress when they expect to leave quickly. Linda sat behind Galton's conference table with a yellow legal pad and a cold cup of coffee, looking, for the first time since any of this began, like a woman who was starting to understand what she was up against. Then the door opened. Not a knock, not a warning. Galton's junior associate, a young man named Price, pushed through it fast enough that the handle hit the wall behind it. His face was the particular shade of pale that comes not from cold, but from reading something that changes the numbers on everything. He was holding a printout in one hand and his phone in the other, and he looked at Galton the way a man looks at someone when he needs them to already know what he's about to say. "The will," Price said, slightly breathless. "He's rewritten it. Completely. Bellick filed it with the county 4 days ago. It's already in the public record." Linda looked up from the legal pad. "What?" Price set the printout on the table. "A full revision. New beneficiaries. The conduct clause is in there. 2 provisions, one covering direct family, one covering public statements. Her name isn't on it." He paused, glancing between Galton and Linda. "Neither is Kayla's." The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when everyone in them is recalculating. Kayla, who had been standing near the window with her arms still crossed, turned slowly toward her mother. The color had left her face. Linda pushed the printout away without reading it, then pulled it back and read the first page. Her jaw tightened. She looked up at Galton. "Can he do this?" Galton didn't answer right away. He picked up the document himself, read 2 paragraphs, and set it down. "He already did," he said quietly. "And given the conduct clause structure, yes. It's clean. Bellick wouldn't have filed it otherwise." "Do you realize," Linda said, her voice dropping something that wasn't quite composed anymore, "what he's actually done here?" Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. She didn't call me. She wouldn't give me the satisfaction. But she sent Kayla over that evening, and Kayla relayed, in clipped tones at Dennis's doorstep, that her mother wanted to know if there was any room for conversation. I thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. "Tell her to contact Howard," I said. "That's where all conversations go now." Kayla opened her mouth, closed it, and left. That night, I sat at the desk in Dennis's guest room with the trust documents spread in front of me. Not because I needed to review them, but because there is a particular satisfaction in looking at a thing you built with patience and foresight, knowing it held exactly the way you designed it to. I thought about every document Linda had waved off, every meeting she'd skipped, every time she'd said, "Just tell me where to sign," as if the signature were the only part that mattered. The signature was never the only part that mattered. It was just the last line of something she'd never bothered to read. The article appeared on a Thursday morning, a local lifestyle publication that Linda had occasionally contributed event coverage to in better years. The headline was measured but pointed. "When the marriage ends, who keeps the life?" Her photo was from 3 summers ago, soft light, a careful smile, the image of a woman who had given generously and been treated poorly. I read it over coffee at Dennis's kitchen table. It was well crafted. She described years of emotional distance, a husband consumed by work and paperwork and the cold machinery of financial management. She talked about feeling invisible, about building a life inside someone else's plan without space for her own needs. She didn't name me directly. The publication's legal team had been careful about that. But Millbrook is not a large city, and anyone who knew us would know exactly who she was describing. The phrase she used that I noted most carefully was, "He treated our shared life like a transaction he was managing, not a marriage he was living." It was a good line. I gave her that. By noon, the article had been shared widely enough that Dennis's wife texted me to ask if I was all right. 2 colleagues sent similar messages. A woman I'd worked with at the county for 12 years called and said, "I hope you know that the people who know you aren't buying this." I thanked her and said nothing else. Howard called at 2:15. His tone was the same as always, measured, deliberate, but I could detect something underneath it. "Readiness. We have the archive prepared," he said. "Your word. Send it." I told him. By 4:30, Howard's office had forwarded a curated file to 3 journalists, 2 legal correspondents, and the editor of the publication that had run Linda's piece. The file was not emotional. It did not editorialize. It contained 14 months of email correspondence between Linda and Barry, including subject lines like "He won't be home until 7 in same place, noon Thursday." 3 voicemail transcripts from Linda to a friend, discussing how to structure the divorce to maximize what she could walk away with. A letter, handwritten and never sent, that Linda had composed during our last anniversary weekend and left in a notebook in her bedside table. I had photographed it 11 months ago, detailing her plans for after the marriage ended. And, perhaps most usefully, a 40-minute recording of Linda and her sister at dinner, laughing about how I had no idea, and joking that men who spent all their time on paperwork deserved what they got. The publication contacted Howard by end of business to inform him that the article would be retracted and a correction issued. He thanked them politely and told them a cease and desist letter would follow regardless, as a matter of formal record. Linda received it the next morning, hand-delivered by a courier who did not introduce himself and did not linger. The letter cited Clause 7.4 of the Trust's conduct-based allocation provisions. Any action causing reputational harm to the Trust or its executive constituted a triggering event with financial consequences. It was signed by Howard. Below his signature was a single line in a different font, colder, more final. The archive is 340 pages. We welcome further engagement. She did not publish anything after that. Her social media went quiet. The lifestyle profile disappeared from the publication's website without explanation. Barry Holt, I learned that same week through Dennis's contact at the business licensing office, had quietly listed his dealership for sale. The listing price was $40,000 below the building's assessed value. He was not haggling. He needed it gone. I thought about calling someone to share the news. Then I decided it didn't warrant a call. It was just a natural consequence of a certain kind of life catching up to the person living it. That happened with or without my involvement. I had simply made sure the timeline was honest. The probate and family court hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in late January. Not a trial. There were no witnesses to call, no dramatic testimony, no jury of peers weighing sympathies. Just a procedural review of the division filings, conducted by a judge who had seen enough high-asset divorces to recognize a lost cause when the paperwork walked through her door. I arrived at the courthouse at 8:40. Howard was already there, standing in the corridor outside courtroom 4 with his briefcase and his habitual stillness, looking like a man who had nothing to prove and nowhere else he'd rather be. We shook hands without ceremony and went over nothing. There was nothing left to go over. Every document had been filed. Every motion had been answered. The case had been decided by the work we'd done quietly over the preceding months. Today was the formality. Linda arrived 12 minutes later with Galton at her side. She was dressed carefully, a charcoal blazer, understated jewelry, the kind of appearance that said composed without trying to appear composed. She looked good. I noticed it without feeling anything particular about it. Galton carried a leather portfolio that I suspected contained far less ammunition than it had 3 months ago. His posture had changed since the first filing. Less assured, more measured. The posture of a man who'd read the documentation and privately revised his expectations downward. We did not speak in the corridor. Linda glanced at me once, a quick, assessing look, then directed her attention to Galton's shoulder. I looked at Howard. He had already turned toward the courtroom doors. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Patricia Dean, 60-something, with the kind of face that communicated efficiency without harshness. She reviewed the submissions without theatrics, reading key passages aloud in a tone that was neither sympathetic to either party nor particularly interested in the human story behind the documents. She was interested in the law. In this case, the law was unambiguous. The Stanton Family Trust, Judge Dean said, not looking up from a file, was established 11 years prior to this filing, predates the marriage by 9 years, and has never incorporated marital funds as documented by independent audit. The assets held therein are non-marital by statute and by instrument. She turned a page. The petitioner's claim to the primary residence is noted. The residence is held under a trust subinstrument established 6 years ago. The claim is denied. Another page. Spousal maintenance is assessed at the statutory baseline, given the petitioner's demonstrated earning capacity and the absence of documented marital contribution to disputed assets. The figure she named was a fraction of what Linda's original demand letter had requested. Galton leaned toward Linda and spoke quietly. Her chin lifted slightly. That particular motion I'd seen 1,000 times at dinner tables and social functions, the one that meant she was absorbing something she didn't want to accept. She didn't speak. Her lips pressed together briefly, then relaxed into a controlled neutral. She turned and looked at me fully for the first time since the corridor. There was something in her eyes that I had not seen there before. Not in 25 years of marriage. Not in the months of legal back and forth. It wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It was something closer to recognition. The particular look of a person who has finally understood the dimensions of what they were dealing with, too late to do anything about it. I didn't look away. I didn't offer anything. Not comfort, not hostility, not acknowledgement. I just held her gaze for a moment, evenly, the way you look at something that is finished. Judge Dean concluded the hearing in 37 minutes. The asset division stood as filed. The maintenance figure was confirmed. The trust governance provisions were upheld without challenge. She asked if either party wished to make a statement. Galton said no. Howard said no. Linda said nothing. Howard gathered his documents without haste, shook the clerk's hand, and walked with me toward the exit. In the corridor, he said only, "That went as expected." I agreed that it had. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for 10 minutes without starting it. Not because I was shaken. I wasn't. But because I believe in allowing a significant moment its proper weight before moving on from it. 25 years had just formally ended in 37 minutes of procedural language. That deserved a few minutes of stillness, even if the stillness was simply the absence of noise. Then I started the car and drove back to work. 9 months after the hearing, I moved out of Dennis's place and into a property I'd been renovating quietly since the spring, a 2-bedroom house on the eastern edge of town, close enough to the agency offices to be convenient, far enough in the old neighborhood to feel like a clean line. I'd done most of the interior work myself on weekends. New floors, new kitchen hardware, a back porch I built from scratch using materials I sourced through a county supplier I'd worked with for years. It wasn't large. It didn't need to be. Barry Holt's dealership sold in March for considerably less than its assessed value. He relocated to a city 2 states west. I heard this from Dennis, who heard it from a mutual contact in the business licensing office, and who reported it in the same tone he used for weather updates. Barry was gone. The chapter he'd written in my life was closed, and I didn't need to track him further. Linda moved into a rental apartment in a newer development on the north side of town. She had the spousal maintenance, the contents of her personal accounts, and her car. What she didn't have was the house, the lake property, the commercial units, the trust assets, or any of the financial architecture she'd assumed was half hers. Galton had filed one appeal, citing inequitable distribution. Howard had responded with a supplemental brief that was, by his own description, thorough. The appeal was denied in 60 days. I heard, through channels I didn't specifically pursue, that she and Barry had stopped seeing each other shortly after his dealership sold. I wasn't surprised. A relationship built on the foundation of someone else's resources tends to develop structural problems once those resources are removed. I noted it and moved on. Kayla and I had 3 conversations over those 9 months. Not warm, not cold. Careful, the way conversations are when 2 people are trying to figure out whether there is still something between them worth the effort of maintaining. She had lost her position at the nonprofit in February, a development connected, as I'd anticipated, to the public record of her statements about the trust and the conduct provisions. She hadn't mentioned it to me directly. I knew from Howard, who had been informed by the Foundation's administrative contact. She called me in July. It was a Sunday evening. She said, without preamble, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." I told her I was glad to hear it. She said, "I think I made choices that I'd make differently now." "That's called growing up," I answered. "It's not a bad thing." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Is there any way back in?" I thought about Howard's reinstatement provision, the annual review, the written acknowledgement, the conduct evaluation. "There's a process," I told her. "Howard will walk you through it. It's not punitive. It's just honest." She said she'd call him. I told her I hoped she would. The Stanton Family Trust, under Howard's stewardship, funded 2 affordable housing projects that year, both under the Millbrook Municipal Development Agency's umbrella, both projects I'd been cultivating for years before any of the personal unraveling began. The trust's philanthropic provisions had always included a community infrastructure component. I'd written that language myself, years ago, because I believed that what a man builds should mean something beyond his own balance sheet. At the ribbon cutting for the second project in October, the county commissioner shook my hand and said, "Stanton, I don't know how you get everything done." I thanked him and said nothing about the year I'd had. Some things don't need explaining to people who weren't there. That evening I sat on the back porch I'd built with my own hands and had a glass of bourbon in the quiet. Across the back fence, a neighbor's dog was investigating something in the yard with the focused dedication of a creature that had no concerns beyond the present moment. I watched it for a while and found the observation unexpectedly settling. I thought about the toast Linda had raised in October of the previous year, to being honest with ourselves. The irony was that she'd said the right thing. She'd just said it in the wrong direction. I had been honest with myself for a long time before that evening, about what I had, what it was worth, what would be required to protect it, and what kind of man I intended to be through the process of losing what turned out not to be mine anyway. The bourbon was good. The porch was solid. The night was quiet in the way that only comes when you've earned it. I wasn't starting over. I was continuing, just from a position that was entirely, finally mine.